The word neutralize became one of the most chilling and controversial terms heard during the ICC confirmation of charges hearing against former President Rodrigo Duterte. On day 3rd, session 2, the prosecution zoomed in on this very word, asking a simple but powerful question. What did neutralize really mean in the context of the so-called war on drugs? Sa pagdinig sa International Criminal Court, paulit-ulit na binanggit ang mga public statements at speeches ni FPRRD kung saan ginagamit ang salitang neutralize. Ayon sa prosecution, hindi raw ito simpleng operational term. Hindi lang ito ibig sabihin ng pag-aresto o pagdisarma. Sa konteksto ng kampanya kontra droga, sinasabi nila na ang neutralize ay madalas tumutukoy sa pagpatay o paggamit ng lethal force laban sa mga pinaghihinalaang drug suspects. The prosecution presented video clips, transcripts, and official police reports. They tried to establish a pattern, that the language used from the top filtered down to law enforcement on the ground. Kapag ang leader umano ng bansa ay nagsasabi ng neutralize them, ang mensahe raw na natatanggap ng mga nasa ibaba ay malinaw, eliminate the target. But the defense strongly pushed back. They argued that neutralize is a standard law enforcement term used worldwide. Ayon sa kampo ni Duterte, ang ibig sabihin nito ay to stop the threat. Maaari itong mga hulugan ng pag-aresto, pag-disable, o pag-control sa isang suspect. Hindi raw automatikong pagpatay ang kahulugan nito. Dito naging sentro ng diskusyon ng intensyon. In international criminal law, words matter, context matters, pattern matters. The prosecution tried to link the rhetoric to the thousands of reported killings during anti-drug operations. They argued that when you combine public speeches encouraging tough action with actual police operations resulting in deaths, it shows more than coincidence. Sa kabilang banda, sinabi ng defense na ang Pilipinas ay may functioning justice system. May mga investigasyon, may mga kaso laban sa ilang pulis. Ipinunto rin nila na maraming operasyon ang nauwi sa nanlaban situations, kung saan ayon sa police reports, ang suspect ay unang nagpaputok kaya napilitang gumanti ang mga pulis. The judges listened carefully. Hindi pa ito trial proper. Confirmation of charges pa lamang ito. The standard here is whether there are substantial grounds to believe that crimes within the ICC's jurisdiction were committed and that the accused is responsible. Hindi pa ito final verdict, kundi pagdedesisyon kung itutuloy ba sa full trial. One key moment in Day 3, Session 2, was when the prosecution highlighted consistency in language across different speeches over the years. They argued that repeated references to killing, finishing criminals, and neutralizing suspects created an environment where lethal force became normalized. Sa social media at sa labas ng korte, hati ang opinyon ng publiko. May mga naniniwala na ang kampanya kontra droga ay kinakailangan noon upang sugpuin ang kriminalidad. May iba namang naniniwala na nagkaroon ng malawakang human rights violations at extrajudicial killings. The defense emphasized sovereignty. They questioned the ICC's jurisdiction, especially after the Philippines withdrew from the Rome Statute. Ngunit iginiit ng prosecution na ang mga alegasyon ay saklaw ng panahong miyembro pa ang bansa sa ICC kaya may jurisdiksyon pa rin ang korte. Sa huli, ang salitang neutralize ay naging simbolo ng mas malalim na debate tungkol sa liderato, pananagutan at kung saan ang hangganan ng kapangyarihan ng Estado laban sa krimen. Words spoken from the highest office carry weight. They can influence policy, action, and perception. Habang nagpapatuloy ang confirmation proceedings, malinaw na hindi lang ito legal battle, kundi battle of narratives. Was neutralize a lawful operational command? O ito ba ay coded language na nagbigay ng signal para sa sistematikong pagpatay? The ICC judges will not decide based on emotions or political opinions. They will examine evidence, context, and legal standards. Sa ngayon, ang mundo ay nakatingin. Ang bawat salita, bawat dokumento, bawat testigo, mahalaga. At sa Day 3, Session 2, isang salita lang ang umalingaw-ngaw sa courtroom. Neutralize. The first keynote centers on one powerful and controversial word, neutralize. During Day 3, Session 2 of the ICC confirmation of charges hearing, this single term became a legal battlefield. The prosecution and the defense both agreed that the word appeared multiple times in public speeches and operational discussions, but they completely disagreed on what it truly meant in context. Sa pagdinig, malinaw na ang issue ay hindi lang tungkol sa dictionary definition ng salita, kundi kung paano ito ginamit, kailan ito ginamit, at ano ang naging epekto nito sa aktual na operasyon sa ground. In ordinary law enforcement language, the word neutralize can mean to stop a threat. It may involve arresting a suspect, disarming someone, or rendering a person incapable of causing harm. The defense leaned heavily on this interpretation. Ayon sa kanila, ang neutralize ay hindi automatic na katumbas ng kill. They argued that in police and military vocabulary worldwide, neutralization does not necessarily imply death. It simply means to eliminate the threat posed by a target, and elimination of a threat can happen in different ways, through arrest, incapacitation, or even persuasion. However, the prosecution insisted that context defines meaning. Hindi raw pwedeng ihiwalay ang salita sa sitwasyon kung saan ito ginamit. They presented video clips and transcripts of speeches where strong and aggressive rhetoric accompanied the term. When neutralize is used alongside statements encouraging toughness, warnings that suspects may be killed, and public praise for deadly outcomes, the prosecution argued that the practical meaning shifts. Sa ganitong konteksto, ang neutralize ay nagiging mas malapit sa lethal action kaysa simpleng pag-aresto. The prosecution's argument focused on patterns. They did not rely on a single speech or a single phrase. Instead, they tried to show repetition over time. Paulit-ulit na paggamit ng parehong salita sa parehong tema ng kampanya kontra droga at kasabay nito ang libu-libong reported deaths during operations. According to their theory, language from the top influences behavior below. When a head of state repeatedly uses forceful language, it may create an atmosphere where law enforcement officers interpret commands more aggressively. Sa international criminal law, intent and knowledge are crucial. Hindi sapat na may namatay. Kailangang maipakita kung may policy o may awareness ang leader sa nangyayari. The prosecution suggested that the repeated use of neutralize, especially when delivered in public addresses to police or military audiences, could indicate encouragement or at least approval of lethal measures. They attempted to frame the word as part of a broader messaging strategy that normalized deadly force in anti-drug operations. The defense countered by challenging the assumption that rhetoric automatically translates into unlawful action. They argued that speeches are often political in nature, delivered with dramatic language intended to emphasize seriousness rather than to provide literal operational instructions. Ayon sa kanila, ang political speeches ay hindi dapat ituring na written orders. They stressed that official police operational manuals and written directives should carry more weight than public speeches when determining intent. Another key dimension of the debate was how law enforcement officers interpret commands. The prosecution implied that officers on the ground might take strong public statements as signals of what leadership expects. Kapag naririnig nila ang salitang neutralize na paulit-ulit, lalo na sa konteksto ng pagbanggit sa mga kriminal na dapat tapusin, maaaring ma-internalize ito bilang pahintulot sa mas marahas na aksyon. The defense rejected this, saying professional officers are trained to follow formal rules of engagement and established protocols, not political soundbites. The judges appeared to focus carefully on whether there was a clear link between language and policy. Confirmation of charges does not require proof beyond reasonable doubt, but it does require substantial grounds to believe crimes were committed and that the accused bears responsibility. Kaya mahalaga ang interpretasyon ng neutralize. If the judges see it as harmless rhetoric or standard terminology, the prosecution's argument weakens. If they view it as part of a pattern encouraging unlawful killings, it strengthens the case for moving to trial. Sa mas malawak na perspektibo, ipinapakita ng diskusyon kung gaano kahalaga ang mga salita ng isang leader. Words from the highest office are not ordinary words. They can shape institutional culture. They can embolden or restrain. The prosecution tried to emphasize that when leaders speak, especially about violence, those words can have real-world consequences. The defense insisted that responsibility must be tied to concrete orders and documented policies, not interpretations of speeches. The courtroom debate also touched on semantics versus substance. The defense warned against criminalizing language without direct evidence of unlawful directives. They argued that if courts begin treating strong rhetoric as proof of criminal intent, it could set a dangerous precedent for political speech worldwide. Samantala, sinabi ng prosecution na hindi ito simpleng usapin ng free speech, kundi usapin ng accountability kung ang mga salita ay may kaugnayan sa malawakang paglabag sa karapatang pantao. Public reaction outside the courtroom mirrored this divide. Some believed that the war on drugs required tough language to deter crime. Others believed that such language dehumanized suspects and made violence easier to justify. Ang salitang neutralize ay naging simbolo ng dalawang magkaibang pananaw. Isa na nakikita ito bilang necessary firmness, at isa na nakikita ito bilang implicit endorsement ng lethal force. Ultimately, the debate over neutralize is about interpretation, context, and consequence. Hindi ito simpleng tanong kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng salita sa diksyonaryo. It is about how that word functioned within a broader campaign, how it was heard by those tasked with enforcement, and whether it contributed to a pattern of conduct that may fall under the ICC's jurisdiction. The judges must weigh language, repetition, surrounding circumstances, and the scale of reported outcomes. Sa pagtatapos ng Session 2, malinaw na ang unang keynote, ang tunay na kahulugan ng neutralize, ay hindi lamang linguistic issue kundi legal at moral na usapin. It stands at the intersection of speech and action, leadership and accountability, interpretation and impact. The court's eventual assessment of this word may significantly influence whether the case proceeds to a full trial and how history will understand the power of rhetoric in times of intense national campaigns against crime. The second keynote focuses on command responsibility and the alleged pattern of violence. During Day 3, Session 2 of the confirmation proceedings, the prosecution attempted to move beyond individual incidents and instead frame the issue as something systematic. Their argument was not limited to isolated police encounters. Instead, they tried to establish that there was a broader environment shaped from the top that may have encouraged or tolerated lethal outcomes in anti-drug operations. Sa puntong ito, naging sentro ang tanong, may pananagutan ba ang isang leader sa mga kilos ng kanyang mga tauhan kung may pattern na nagpapakita ng paulit-ulit na resulta? In international criminal law, command responsibility is not about physically committing the crime. It is about authority, control, knowledge, and failure to prevent or punish unlawful acts. The prosecution's theory suggested that when a leader has effective control over subordinates and is aware, or should have been aware, of widespread unlawful actions, responsibility can arise if no meaningful steps were taken to stop them. Hindi kailangan na may written order na nagsasabing patayin. Ang mahalaga ay kung may awareness at kung may ginawa ba upang pigilan o imbestigahan ang mga insidente. The prosecution pointed to statistical patterns. They emphasized the scale of reported killings during anti-drug operations, arguing that the volume alone raises questions. Kapag libo-libong operasyon ang nauuwi sa pagkamatay ng suspect, at madalas pare-pareho ang narrative na nanlaban, sinasabi ng prosecution na maaaring hindi na ito simpleng coincidence. They argued that repetition of similar circumstances could suggest a consistent operational approach rather than random, unrelated incidents. Another element raised was public messaging. The prosecution connected strong rhetoric with the operational climate. They argued that when leadership repeatedly emphasizes toughness and publicly praises aggressive enforcement, it may create an institutional culture where officers feel protected or even rewarded for lethal outcomes. Sa ganitong pananaw, ang pattern ay hindi lamang sa dami ng insidente kundi sa consistency ng mensahe mula sa itaas at sa consistency ng resulta sa ibaba. The defense firmly rejected this narrative. They argued that correlation does not equal causation. Ayon sa kanila, ang mataas na bilang ng mga namatay ay maaaring dahil sa mataas din ang antas ng kriminalidad at armado ang maraming suspect. They stressed that each police operation should be evaluated individually, not lumped together into a generalized pattern. For the defense, without proof that the accused issued unlawful directives or knowingly allowed illegal acts, the theory of command responsibility becomes speculative. The defense also highlighted the existence of domestic investigative mechanisms. They pointed out that some officers were investigated and in certain cases, prosecuted. Para sa kanila, ipinapakita nito na hindi policy ng Estado ang pumatay ng labag sa batas. If there are investigations and disciplinary processes, they argued, that undermines the claim of a systematic plan to commit crimes. According to this view, isolated abuses by individuals do not automatically translate into a state policy or a leader's criminal liability. The prosecution, however, questioned the effectiveness and scope of those investigations. They suggested that limited accountability in the face of large-scale allegations could indicate tolerance or insufficient action. In the doctrine of command responsibility, failure to act can be as significant as direct action. Kung alam ng isang leader ang nangyayari at hindi niya pinigilan o pinarusahan, maaari pa rin siyang managot sa ilalim ng international law. A crucial aspect of this keynote is the concept of effective control. The judges must consider whether the accused had actual authority and practical ability to influence police operations. Hindi sapat ang title o posisyon lamang, kailangang suriin kung may real power to issue instructions, change policies, or discipline subordinates. The prosecution tried to demonstrate that as head of state, the accused had significant influence over law enforcement agencies. The defense responded that operational decisions in the field are made by officers based on immediate threats and circumstances, not direct supervision from the president. The debate also explored the idea of foreseeability. If repeated incidents occur with similar outcomes, at what point does a leader become aware that there may be a problem? And once aware, what steps are required under international law? The prosecution implied that widespread reports, media coverage, and international concern would have made it impossible not to know. The defense argued that awareness of allegations is different from confirmation of unlawful conduct, and leaders must rely on official investigations rather than unverified claims. Sa confirmation stage, hindi pa kailangang patunayan ang guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution only needs to show substantial grounds to believe that crimes within the court's jurisdiction were committed and that the accused bears responsibility. This lower threshold makes the pattern argument particularly important. If the judges see enough consistency in evidence, reports, and messaging to suggest a possible systematic approach, they may allow the case to proceed to full trial. Outside the courtroom, the issue of command responsibility resonates deeply. For supporters, strong leadership during a crisis is necessary, and they view aggressive enforcement as a response to serious societal problems. For critics, the scale of reported deaths signals a failure of restraint and oversight. Ang debate ay hindi lamang legal, kundi moral at political din. It touches on how far a government can go in fighting crime and what safeguards must remain in place. Ultimately, the second keynote highlights the complexity of leadership accountability. Hindi ito simpleng usapin ng isang utos o isang insidente. It is about patterns, authority, awareness, and action or inaction. The prosecution seeks to weave together statistics, speeches, and operational outcomes into a coherent narrative of responsibility. The defense seeks to separate them, emphasizing individual circumstances and the absence of explicit unlawful orders. The judges must carefully weigh whether the available evidence suggests a coordinated policy or merely a series of tragic but disconnected events. They must assess whether effective control existed and whether there were reasonable steps taken to prevent or punish abuses. In doing so, they are not only deciding on the fate of one individual, but also clarifying how international law interprets leadership responsibility in large-scale law enforcement campaigns. The third keynote centers on jurisdiction and sovereignty, a crucial legal battleground that could determine whether the case moves forward to a full trial. During Day 3, Session 2 of the confirmation proceedings, arguments did not only revolve around facts and alleged patterns of violence, they also focused intensely on whether the International Criminal Court even has the authority to hear the case. Sa madaling salita, bago pa pag-usapan ang guilt or innocence, kailangang sagutin muna ang tanong, may jurisdiction ba ang ICC? The defense strongly emphasized the issue of sovereignty. They argued that the Philippines, as a sovereign state, has its own judicial system, capable of investigating and prosecuting alleged crimes. Ayon sa kanila, ang prinsipyo ng complementarity sa ilalim ng Rome Statute ay malinaw. The ICC is a court of last resort. It steps in only when a state is unwilling or unable genuinely to carry out investigations or prosecutions. Therefore, if domestic mechanisms exist and function, the ICC should not interfere. Another major argument raised by the defense concerns the withdrawal of the Philippines from the Rome Statute. The country formally withdrew from the ICC in 2019. The defense contends that once a state withdraws, it should no longer be subject to the court's authority. Para sa kanila, pagpapatuloy ng kaso ay tila paglabag sa sovereign decision ng isang bansa na umalis sa isang international treaty. They frame it as a matter of respecting national independence and self-determination. The prosecution, however, presented a different interpretation. They argued that jurisdiction is determined by the time when the alleged crimes were committed. If the acts in question occurred while the Philippines was still a state party to the Rome Statute, then the ICC retains jurisdiction over those acts, even if the country later withdraws. Sa ganitong pananaw, ang pag-alis sa ICC ay hindi nag-i-erase ng accountability para sa mga alegasyon na nangyari noong miyembro pa ang bansa. This interpretation relies on the principle that treaty obligations cannot simply be erased retroactively. According to the prosecution's reasoning, withdrawal stops future jurisdiction, but does not cancel obligations for past conduct within the membership period. They emphasized that allowing withdrawal to automatically block investigations would create a loophole. A state could theoretically withdraw immediately after allegations arise to avoid scrutiny, undermining the entire purpose of the court. The judges must therefore analyze the timeline carefully. Kailan umano nangyari ang mga alegadong krimen? Was the Philippines still bound by the Rome Statute at that time? If yes, the prosecution argues, then the court's authority remains intact for those specific events. This technical yet fundamental issue may shape the entire direction of the proceedings. Beyond the technical aspects, the sovereignty debate carries symbolic weight. Supporters of the defense often frame the ICC's involvement as external interference in domestic affairs. They argue that law enforcement campaigns, especially those addressing internal crime problems, fall squarely within national jurisdiction. For them, international intervention risks politicizing domestic policies and undermining local democratic processes. On the other hand, proponents of ICC involvement emphasize that international criminal law exists precisely to address situations where domestic systems may face limitations. The principle of complementarity does not automatically block ICC action simply because investigations exist. The court must assess whether those investigations are genuine, independent, and capable of addressing the full scope of alleged crimes. Kung may kakulangan or selective prosecution lamang, maaaring magpatuloy ang ICC. Another layer of the jurisdiction debate involves the scope of alleged crimes. The ICC deals only with specific crimes under its mandate, such as crimes against humanity. Hindi ito general human rights court. Therefore, the prosecution must show that the allegations fall within the defined categories under the Rome Statute and that they meet the required legal thresholds. The defense, in turn, may argue that the situation does not meet those thresholds or that domestic law is more appropriate to handle such matters. Sa confirmation stage, hindi pa final ang desisyon kung may jurisdiction. However, the judges must be satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to proceed. If they find that jurisdiction clearly does not exist, the case could end at this stage. If they find that jurisdiction is established for the relevant time period and alleged conduct, the matter moves forward toward trial. The sovereignty argument also intersects with political realities. International courts operate in a world of independent states. Cooperation from states is essential for investigations, evidence gathering, and enforcement. Without state cooperation, proceedings become more complex. Kaya ang usapin ng jurisdiksyon ay hindi lamang legal, kundi practical din. It affects how the court can function and whether it can effectively carry out its mandate. Public opinion reflects this tension. Some view ICC proceedings as a necessary mechanism to ensure accountability beyond national politics. Others see them as challenges to national pride and autonomy. Ang debate ay nagiging mas malawak pa kaysa sa isang kaso. Ito ay tungkol sa relasyon ng isang bansa sa international legal order. Ultimately, the third keynote underscores that jurisdiction is not a minor technicality. It is foundational. Without jurisdiction, there can be no trial. The judges must interpret treaty provisions, analyze timelines, consider complementarity, and weigh sovereignty concerns. Their decision on this matter will not only determine the future of the case, but may also contribute to broader jurisprudence about how withdrawal from international treaties affects accountability for past actions. In this phase of the proceedings, the courtroom becomes a space where domestic authority and international oversight intersect. The outcome will clarify how the balance between national sovereignty and global justice mechanisms is maintained. Whether the ICC proceeds or not depends heavily on how convincingly each side addresses the complex interplay between membership status, alleged conduct, and the enduring reach of international legal obligations.